Richard, I am free of the gunfighters now, aren't I?
Gav.
I'm scared.
There isn't any need to be.
I'm still having terrible dreams.
It's your mind's way of coping with the experience. You've suffered a great deal.
That could have been prevented if only Donald Cotton had paid more attention to his historical research.
No, it couldn't. Jerry Davis and Innes Lloyd would always have drawn it more towards the legend.
The feelings of hate. Richard, I couldn't go through it again.
Well, you're completely free of it now, Gav. For you, the gunfighters is dead. Forever.
For all of us, I hope.
It's over.
Can you take us back to England?
You want to leave us?
I want to be surrounded by familiar things.
How about public schools? You can't get much more English than that.
You'll forget the gunfighters, Gav. It won't always be as painful as it is now.
Actually, it might not just be Gav. These two stories are all about amnesia.
Oh, I'd forgotten that.
Hello and welcome to the podcast where we take something old, a Doctor Who story from the original series, compare it with something new, one from the new series, and add something borrowed, our sketch just then, to make Something Who. Yes, it's Something Who, podcast episode 44. I'm Richard, and we're back with another look at a pair of Doctor Who stories, this time set in English public schools. First we've got 5th Doctor story Mawdryn Undead from season 20, and then we'll take a look at 10th Doctor adventure Human Nature, the Family of Blood from series 3. And with me to chew over these tales of educational misdemeanours are Big Finish writer and Missing Episodes podcaster Paul. Hello.
Good evening.
Yeah. And also we've got astrophysics author Giles.
Evening.
And restored to the bosom of Something Who, after being relegated last time to the scanner screen, it's graphics designer and half of the Dalek 63 to 88 phenomenon, Gav.
Good evening. I'm a half phenomenon. I like it.
Are you 63 or are you 88?
Somewhere in the middle. I'm one of each. I'm the units of 10 from one column. And anyway, it doesn't matter. Carry on.
Very good.
Not even going to finish my own jokes tonight. That's the standard we reached.
So Sirens of Audio recently put out a podcast looking at their Doctor Who podcast picks. And very kindly, they mentioned Something Who. I mean, not quite as much as they mentioned Paul Morris, but I mean, they did mention our podcast.
So you tell me. Yeah. Should I be worried?
No, well, they love your Missing Episodes and, of course, your Big Finish stories. So I think you're...
Bless them.
Yeah.
I must get to work on something they won't like.
So that was nice for us to hear. Thanks, Dwayne, for mentioning us and making sure that our Antipodean friends have some knowledge of Something Who is a podcast. And also, in the last months ago, I was a guest on the Primary Sources, an episode from a Doctor Who show. But just in the last week, it finally came out. So that was a nice surprise for me to find out what it was I actually said all those months ago. Probably a slightly less nice surprise for everyone else to discover I was on it. But there we go. So, Rob, thanks for asking me to come on that, and that was fun as well. So let's kick off with Mawdryn Undead, written by Peter Grimwade and directed by Peter Moffat. I mean, that's enough to strike fear into anyone, isn't it, actually, thinking about it? The guy who knows how to direct decides to write something, and then they bring in the guy, I mean, let's face it, he's directed a lot of stuff, but, none of it with any great distinction. It's the third story. Well, okay, there's the 5 Doctors, I suppose. It's the third story of season 20. It's the start of a 3-story Black Guardian arc, and introducing new companion Turlough, who's got something that they're desperate to say about Mawdryn Undead. We never see Turlough's hat again, do we? Why? I wonder why that is. It's such a lovely hat.
It's interesting they go down the Bota route. That's given us a sort of Brideshead revisited flavour, isn't it? Which is a rather specific sort of thing, rather than no Botas to be seen in spoilers in the second story we're covering tonight. I don't know, isn't it more a university age thing than a prep school sort of thing? Don't know. Anyone posh can help me out with that?
No.
We didn't have hats.
Are they wearing those revolting blazers as well?
I'm only half posh, so I went to an independent school, but it wasn't a public school.
Yeah, it's a bit funny they didn't do I did make a note. It's funny they didn't do a bait and switch on that and actually have more fun with, given that you've got two boys in, as you say, Brideshead Revisited era outfits, and then they're standing next to a vintage car. It's a bit funny they don't go a bit further with that before going, haha, I know we're actually in the present.
Yes, well, there you go. Probably no point trying to look into Peter Grimway's influences.
There's no plasmatons in this one.
No. He's a funny writer, isn't he? Did he ever write for anything else other than Doctor Who? I remember Eric Saywood. In fact, I'm going to be quoting lots of half-dredged up memories I've got of people involved in his production criticising each other after the event. Eric Saywood was always criticising John Nathan Turner for employing Grimwade as a writer and not as a director, as you pointed out. I think he said he inherited him the script for Time Flight, which he didn't want to do, but then for some reason, why did he bring him back twice more? I think he said Nathan Turner was very keen on him, and he thought he should have been used more as a director. Grimwade himself thought that he should have been used as a director on his own scripts and couldn't understand why. Thought that made a lot of sense, which of course it does. It does make a lot of sense.
It would have been interesting to see.
I think the TV industry had to wait a lot longer to catch up, decades really. I mean, I can't think of many other examples. There have been other writers have managed that in fits and starts, but I mean, even Dennis Potter got a lot of criticism when he tried directing himself. Yes, Grimwade has complained. I can just remember little things he complained about in the production. They're very small things, but I think they're illustrative of the fact that he thought Moffat and the actors he employed didn't understand what he was going for. But things like the little things, the performance of the nurse or the matron, he said was completely wrong. She's played very sympathetically, and he said she should have been a dreadful old harridan. And my main reaction to that is, if it's not clear, couldn't you have put that in the script?
Yeah.
The nurse, the matron, says she is a dreadful old harridan.
Yeah.
So A, he didn't, and B, it wasn't clear enough from the dialogue how it needed to be played. So, it kind of bounces back on the writer himself there and makes me think it's all very well moaning after the fact. The only one that stuck in my brain, but I think it's probably there were probably many other things he wasn't happy about. He probably complained that the actor playing, what's his name, Hippo, was not a plus size actor. But of course that is worth commenting on, because he's referred to over and over again as being fat in the script and isn't, which is slightly bewildering. You'd think you'd either cast somebody to go with this. It's not like it's going to add an extra dimension to his character. It's just a very cliched, superficial thing. But it would at least stop you, or that will change the dialogue so the viewer wouldn't keep thinking, hang on, am I missing something here?
I mean, he is about 30, but he isn't particularly fat.
No, that's just part of the great tradition of school set dramas, isn't it? On both sides of the Atlantic.
Do we know, presumably before Turlough was written in, that role was the schoolboy, wasn't it? So Turlough was kind of a fusion of what I presume was originally the Hippo role and the creating of the new companion. I guess Hippo would have been the prominent sort of hanger-on of the story, because he kind of just disappears as this goes on.
Yeah.
As I assume Turlough takes over that role when he had to perform his rewrites.
My understanding of it was that this story, as usual, gleaned from production notes and so on, was that this story is kind of a case of ending up with a scenario because of a whole chain of events that sort of came about by accident, and they ended up with this particular setting. But I mean, I'm not aware that there was a school story that existed independently of the need to introduce Turlough, because this replaced the Space Whale.
Oh, did it? Good grief!
Yes, I mean, one of many stories to replace the Space Whale at various points. But I understood that Turlough was going to be living in the Space Whale.
It's not a sentence I would thought I'd hear.
The intention was that this was the first of a trilogy to the Turlough trilogy, Black Guardian trilogy, and that they then, when they dropped the Space Whale and got Grimwade rather, to come up with something else, then they sort of, Turlough was inherited, and the need to introduce that character was in there anyway.
I believe the running order was switched. My understanding is that Mordrin Undead was a later story with Turlough, but didn't have to introduce him, and that the public school setting had a protagonist that was a schoolboy. And then when Mordrin Undead was switched to become the story that introduced Turlough, they made Turlough a resident of that school and sidelined the schoolboy character that had been the main boy of the story, I think.
So Turlough we could have been denied Turlough's iconic costume.
Yeah.
I say that with an entirely straight face. I mean, imagine he might have been dressed in some sort of ridiculous alien garb. He could have been Adric Mark II. No,
Well, he was, wasn't he? Adric had been devised as a sort of antagonist in the TARDIS crew, almost like an evil companion, but not quite. And so Nathan Turner had decided to go further with the Adric replacement by properly trying to go for an evil companion. Yeah, I guess it's quite a deliberate thing to replace one futuristic lad companion with another. And yeah, you could have been whatever garb you have inside a space whale. A wetsuit.
What a fascinating character he is. So without this schoolboy aspect, I wonder what else there would have been in the... Well, I suppose the personality would still have been much the same. And it's not like we're encouraged to think of him as 17 years old at any point after this, or indeed during this, to be honest. But
yeah, there's not a great deal done with the schoolboy backdrop. And he doesn't disguise it very well either. I mean, I was quite surprised at that scene where he just halfway through the story confesses his whole situation to someone he thinks is his headmaster.
Yeah.
And he's like, yes, I'm an alien and I've got to kill this other alien and I've met this other alien who's sort of blackmailing me and it's a bit of a nightmare. And he doesn't think it's weird that the headmaster's just going, well, you are in a pickle, aren't you? But it's one of those things, he wanted that scene in it, so it happened.
Mark Strickson makes a very strong impression, doesn't he? I think he's tremendously good. There's a slight tendency towards overacting, but I think that becomes part of the character's charm quite quickly.
For an evil companion, he's, I think, somewhat more likable than the two supposedly non-evil companions.
Well, they do... Yeah, I was a bit confused. Tegan takes against him, whereas Nyssa is acting as though she doesn't trust him, but then says that she does, that she quite likes him. I think this may be only at the very end of the story, which slightly confused me.
Is Nyssa actually in this story? I must say, she disappeared for most of it.
She gets a new costume, of course she's in this story.
She's getting 24 hours sleep with the Delta Wave augmenter. I'll tell you what, while we were on the subject of the complicated genesis of this story, who wrote it, when and why, how does the alleged original intention to include Ian Chesterton rather than the Brigadier fit into all of this? Is that a last-minute or a relatively last-minute change?
No, that's the reason it's set in a school, because the idea was Grimwade wanted to set a story in two time periods, and they were originally centuries apart, and it was encouraged that they narrow that gap and have a single linking figure between the two time zones. And legend has it, presumably Ian Levine's own legend, says that he suggested that it should be a past companion. That became Ian Chesterton.
Right.
I don't know why. I think just because it was the first and most logical thing for one of the first companions, and that determined the setting of the boys' school, because Ian would be a teacher. They then bothered to check, and William Russell wasn't available. So then they
why would you? Why would you bother to check?
I know.
The actor was available.
Yeah, just like last-minute thing. So then they looked at Ian Marter. So it was Harry, and he wasn't available. And so then they approached Nick Courtney, and he was available. So they just stuck the Brigadier in as a teacher. Going
down the list of former companions in descending order of likelihood that they could have ever been a teacher. I always have really mixed feelings about this on several levels. I mean, I'm not going to say anything very startling here. I love Ian Chesterton. I would have loved to have seen him back, and we never got him, did we? So it's a shame that there were other opportunities later. It's not anyone's fault that they didn't try again at any point over the next 30 years. I do think it would have made slightly more sense. I don't know if it would have been better on any other level. And I'm not one of those people. It was very fashionable at one stage to be very irritated at the inclusion of the Brigadier here, because it buggers up. It made just a character point for this story, but in the wider picture, it buggers up the whole of the unit dating, apparently. As if it all made complete sense before Mordrin Undead. But I think this is...
So that was the unit dating
Yes.
horn going off there, wasn't it?
It was actually the unit dating elephant in the room before Mordred Undead, and this just brought to the surface the fact that we need to have a chat about these things.
They'd have had to have done a lot more digging, given that so much of it seems to rely on regeneration, and you just think if you start with Ian Chesterton, then you've got an awful lot of
That's true.
stuff to explain. You can't have, once you're through the idea that he remembers the Doctor.
Yeah.
It's not
very
as
true.
much of a, it's not as much of a barrier for the Brigadier than any of the other candidates to then get to grips with the idea that it is you. You've just got another face.
And I don't want Ian to be stuck in a boys' school without his lovely Barbara
true.
for all this time, and also to lose 6 years of his life. I mean, not that I'm particularly enthusiastic about the Brigadier having a breakdown and suffering 6 years of torment, but we're left with what we've got, I suppose.
I think when I was younger, I used to think that it made more sense. It would have made more sense with Ian Chesterton because more time had passed. So I could believe that he'd forgotten the Doctor. But now I think back on that. Those were the ramblings of a young person. It's only, the difference is just a decade, isn't it? And a decade's nothing to me now. Grizzled old Paul.
But also the amnesia is a technical
It is
point,
a plot
isn't
point,
it?
yeah. I mean, maybe they have to lean on it more heavily to explain why the Brigadier, who was with the Doctor for longer and more recently and in much more extraordinary circumstances, would forget. But of course, I always forget how quickly they get over that amnesia. I mean, it's just half an episode, really, isn't it? From the point at which they meet to it being resolved is very quick. So,
Yeah.
mercifully. Well, I say mercifully. I mean, it could have been written well. There could have been a way of dragging it out throughout the whole story and doing it well, but I don't think we would have got that.
One thing that struck me watching this again today, I had generally positive feelings before today from my memory. I probably last watched this, I don't know, 5 years ago. Coming at this relatively fresh, I was really surprised by how sort of negative it is and downbeat. You would think that bringing a beloved character back would be a joyful experience. And we're presented with this character who in 1983 is sad and alone and dishevelled and confused and a shadow of his former self. And then we're introduced to the notion that encountering the Doctor in 1977 has caused that as well.
Yeah.
So you've got this situation where he meets his old friend in 1977. It ruins his life for 6 years.
Yeah.
The Doctor catches up with him, and he's living in a crappy shed with a rubbish kitchen and newspapers all over the place and a sad picture of himself. It's so ironic that this was done as fan service. And the first thing that's done is the unit dating fiasco, which Ian Levine says, no, you can't do that in 1977 because that will cause a lot of problems. And John Nathan Turner said, yeah, but I want to do the Silver Jubilee, so what is this for the fans or not? Okay, fine. So we're introduced to this beloved character whose life is in tatters, and he's a sad shadow of his former self, moping around on his own. And that's not enough. We get to hear about the other old friends from the unit family. How's Sergeant Benton doing? Oh, he's a used car salesman now.
Yeah.
All right. So he didn't go on to do great things. I mean, you think, what's next? Like, what's Corporal Bell doing these days? She sells concrete mix for a small contractor in the northwest. All right, okay. What? Captain Yates? Did he recover? No, he struggled with depression and he's
dead.
Yes, he spiraled into alcoholism and he's dead now. So it's a great celebration to have all this fun stuff back. But the tone of the story is just so joyless. There are 2 jokes, and they're squeezed out of this dry script. And Nick Courtney does absolutely everything he can, and he makes every scene that he's in. And he is the absolute beating heart of that story. If it's not Nick Courtney, the whole thing is dead on arrival.
He is fighting against the script, isn't he? Because the Brigadier also isn't always really, I'm not going to say in character, because he's not out of character, but he's lacking the spark that the Brigadier had. And again, I sound like I'm just missing the point that this version of the Brigadier has been through all these problems and so on and so on. But I just think the writing doesn't quite capture. I think it's accidental. I don't think that he's deliberately showing us a convincing different version of the Brigadier after he's been through these trials. I think he's just not really very interested in writing the Brigadier the way he was.
But it's also that thing of, I mean, I appreciate I'm having a make-believe argument with Peter Grimwade, but sometimes writers will say, oh, but that's what would have happened. The character is like that. He is sad because of the way his life's gone. No, you wrote him like that. You decided he was sad. Why couldn't he have gone on to be Admiral of the entire universe or whatever? You decided he was sad.
I think that's what Ben Aronovich thinks about this, isn't it? And that's what he was trying to address in Battlefield. I've got a vague feeling. And
at least he got Doris.
There were some aspects of Battlefield that I wasn't sure about at the time. I remember thinking it was not so much contrived, but almost slightly ludicrous that he gets the Brigadier back in his uniform and gets him back into the action at his age. But, looking back at it now, I'm thinking, thank God we got to see that again after this.
Yeah.
It might be a little bit, it might be pushing it a little, but it needed it. We didn't want to leave him here.
I mean, I think it is fantastic that Nick Courtney manages to create two completely different versions of the Brigadier that you sort of believably think they're quite distinct from each other. And they do, I guess, also dress up that Shed a couple of different ways. So it does give you the sense that he was a different character 6 years before.
I thought that was quite a neat little thing. The 1977 version is tidy and neat, and it's got more plants in it, so it's more of a kind of living environment. And the later version, I think, has basically the same props, but the snazzier ones are dumped in the corner, and there's just newspapers piled up, and it's a small detail, but
it's got a leaky roof and a musty smell just lingering. He does a great performance. He almost manages to look thinner playing 1977 Brigadier. I've no idea how he does that. He's just holding his breath.
Yeah, it must be.
Anyway, it's he gives it his all. And I suppose it is probably easier to make two distinctive brigadiers than it would have been with Ian Chesterton. I mean, okay, you've dyed his hair, so he's got dark hair, then he's grey. You've got a moustache. And lost the moustache. But then, as you said, there's the whole military bearing which disappears and is replaced with something a bit more comfortable. Whereas Ian Chesterton, I just can't imagine how the 6-year-older Ian, unless he's got an eye patch or something, would be so distinct. Well, horses, of course, swings and roundabouts.
Yeah. That's the thing. He doesn't look like he's that far past Terror of the Zygons.
No.
Things in his 76 incarnation, does he?
I would have rather heard a list of stories of what happened to all those Brigadier substitutes, like those idiots from the Andor invasion, the Seeds of Doom. He could have told us what fates had befallen them.
You could have a spin-off anthology series with a different Brigadier each week, getting his comeuppance due to a mishandled alien invasion.
Yeah, and of course, that flashback sequence was one of the great glories of early 80s Doctor Who. I mean, in the pre-video era, in the time when we didn't have access to all of the old adventures. At least, this was sort of about 2 minutes, minute and a half, something like that, of short clips of stuff. Something as old as the invasion. It was as a frisson going through every teenage Doctor Who fan's heart as they watched those.
Yes, that was Ian Levine's compromise for not being allowed to get the continuity right. You can have 2.5 minutes of clips.
It's really funny that apparently Grimwade had the idea that once they'd come up with this idea of having a linking character and narrowing the time differential, as it were, that it was Grimwade that said, well, why don't we make it a companion, a former companion, apparently.
Didn't he suggest in Chesterton? He remembered him from the. It wasn't Levine, I don't think.
It's just funny. You think, and this is kind of the genesis of the Brigadier being the absolute touchstone of Doctor Who and carrying on right up until less than whenever it was Matt Smith era and Sarah Jane and stuff like that.
It's nice if we get to see both versions of the Brigadier. It's the start of Comfy Brigadier, Comfy Brigadier from 5 Doctors, Battlefield and Sarah Jane in his tweed.
It's funny to think if we hadn't had him in this, then we presumably would have had him in the 5 Doctors, I guess. And again, that's the case where he absolutely, as we said when we watched that, he was pretty much the star of the show, really, in that as well, and it's the best thing in it.
He's making lines funny in Mordrin Undead that aren't written particularly funny. He's got a sparkle that really lifts it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Peter Davison seems to be in quite a bad mood in this one. He's playing up the Tetch side of his Doctor. I'm never quite sure why he does that. There are a couple of jokes he tramples on.
And there's a couple of really morose bits for no good reason. There's a bit, just one I can remember, where Brigadier says, "How long will the journey take?" And the Doctor says, "Come on," but he doesn't do it in a "Isn't it marvelous how quick it was" way. He does it in a "You're an idiot for even asking" way, and kind of tuts at him and storms off. And there's just like the momentary unkindness for no reason. And there's a few of those scattered throughout. It's odd.
I'd love to ask him where all that comes from. It makes me wonder if it's his idea of playing a sort of young William Hartnell, and he's been misinformed about what young First Doctor was like, what the First Doctor was like, and is playing it more grouchy than he needs to.
I think he's just realised he's got 3 years to play the Doctor, and this middle one is an absolute bust, and he's really brushed off.
Well, it's not a great script, is it? There's not a lot of zing to the dialogue. There's so much you could play with here.
Yeah, I mean, conceptually, and that's the thing. Conceptually, I like it, but it's just the script itself falls flat. And conceptually, this is about as Moffaty as in Stephen, not as in Peter, as the old series gets. I mean, you can imagine the companion arc, so that's that sort of element that we've already discussed, and this whole thing about the whole Mordrin thing that I guess we'll come on to, and the meaning of what it is to be the Doctor and the mucking around with regeneration abilities, the threat of taking that away and so on. It's quite
There's an awful lot of wasted potential. I have really strong memories of reading the Target book. Obviously, it's easier to achieve on the page, but I remember the misdirection with Mordrin working really well. But on
even
screen,
better than it does here.
If you can believe it, it was even better than on screen. And that's the thing, is it fails in quite a few different directions. But I mean, it's so implausible. They're going back and forth about the Doctor has the power to regenerate. He could have changed. And you think, yeah, but it's patently not him. He's not talking to you like he's your friend. He's not in the right coloured clothes that you saw him in 30 seconds ago. They're tattered rags, but they're still purple.
They don't have that discussion until an episode or two later. The damage is done the very first scene when they rush in and say, "Doctor!" And there's not even just a few lines of, "Who's this? Is it? It can't be."
Yeah.
But surely, but no.
I mean, the irony is that later in the story, when he gets his full clothing on, he has quite a lot of beige and peachy colours. You could tatter that into a cricketing outfit to sell that lie.
Yeah, considering how important it is that it seemed believable that they think it's the Doctor, and for it not to seem ludicrously contrived, you could have a small amount of contrivance to maybe get him into a version of the Doctor's costume. Which then,
I mean, he puts on Tom Baker's coat in the next scene.
Yeah,
he could have just taken a spare.
If the Doctor had left his jacket in the transmat and
go.
Because it's a hot day or something, and then Morgan puts it on. It's something as simple as that.
Rather than have him in a purple loincloth and then go, "Oh, it's definitely the Doctor in his trusty purple loincloth." Good Lord.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know what he wears under those trousers, I suppose.
It's no less plausible than Edmund Warwick in The Chase.
So is that what Tegan should have said to this? Sometimes he does this. Every so often, when you look at him from a distance, he looks almost like a different man. With his voice badly dubbed in.
I was reminded today of, I'd forgotten about the fact that David Bradley's face is addressed at the start of Twice Upon a Time, which I'd forgotten. Peter Capaldi's Doctor says, "Oh, your regeneration's going, look what's happened to your face." It's because it's really jarring, because recasting is one of those things you're just not supposed to notice. Yeah. So mistaking David Collins for the Doctor. The thing was, that drama of are they going to believe he's the Doctor teeters on the brink of really working and just continually undermines itself. There's one moment where Mordrin's really clever and he's remembered each of their names and he uses their names and calls them my old friends. And at that moment you think that's what a huge chunk of this episode should have been. It should have been Mordrin being really clever and really shaking their... But instead, the rest of the time, he's just being Mordrin and he's shouting at Tegan and calling her a prattling child. And you just think, well, you're blowing your own cover here. This just needs carefully writing.
Isn't there also a way, and this is just throwing us out there, there's also a way of making the audience unsure if this really is the Doctor or not. It wouldn't have needed a lot of fiddling with to get that effect. And then it's not like there's so much plot that you couldn't have gone with something big and even bolder like that. There's very little plot in this. It's a lot, mostly running around to fill the 4 episodes.
Yeah.
In my opinion. So it could have been replaced with something more character-based or a bit of mystery rather than just spinning your wheels for 2 episodes.
There's a chunk of episode 2 where it's really, really working. Everything's clicked, and it's making full use of the 2 different time zones. And modern Brigadier is feeding information about past Brigadier. The 2 narratives are told in parallel.
That's very confident.
And yes, and I think that is the bit that I always think that the whole rest of this story is as good as. And then I always forget that it's not.
Yeah.
Because that's my abiding memory of how clever the 2 time zones are, and they interplay, and that goes by the end of episode 2, and then it's just 2 episodes on the ship.
It's a real shame, isn't it? Because the last 2 episodes, it's a bit like that episode 3 of the Romans that we talked about a couple of months ago. Because by episode 3, you've got 2 brigadiers, Turlough, the Black Guardian, Nyssa, Tegan, the Doctor, Mordred and his 7 mates, and they're all wandering around the ship in different directions, trying not to bump into each other.
Without the benefit of it being played as fast. I'd have preferred even bad, not quite working fast. And as you say, Gavin, in episode 2, it's all very clear. The complicated plotting is working, the logic. And if he's done anything right, Pete Grimwade has worked out the logic of his... he must have drawn it on a roll of wallpaper like John Cleese plotting Fawlty Towers. He's got it all worked out perfectly. At that stage, it's simple enough and being explained clearly enough that the audience can follow it. But then later on, as we go into episode 3 and 4, the permutations of where people are and what must or mustn't happen if they meet is just becoming... I couldn't follow it.
Well, neither can Turlough, and that's the problem. Is that he then has a cross conversation with the Black Guardian, and the Black Guardian's like, "What are you doing, you idiot?" And Turlough's like, "Well, you told me to do that." And the Black Guardian's like, "No, the plot's changed since the last bit. Now I want you to do something slightly different, and you should have known." And Turlough's like, "Oh, for God's sake, how was I meant to know?" So yeah, it's all over the place, and everyone's motives are changing from one scene to the next.
And what really ruins it for me is the pacing. So that we've run out of character-led plot, and now it's all become a bit mechanical. And at the same time, Grimwade decides to speed up the pacing, so we get endless short scenes of people walking down corridors, coming down stairways, in and out of doors. All I can see when I'm watching it is my brain's... I can't follow it, so I'm starting to think about the production blocks and think, oh, they must have done all those... Oh, those poor actors. They've got a 5-second scene, and they're told to come through that door and walk across there. That's all I could see was people, actors being hurriedly marshalled about a studio, barely having any idea what they were doing. And I think he thinks... I was trying to remember if Grimwade's other stories have this stuff of this misguidedly fast-paced editing. Does he think is he trying to write it like a film? And then I thought, well, perhaps he is, because of course he famously, when he directs, he can make it feel filmic, like on Earthshock. So maybe having succeeded on Earthshock, he's now thinking, if I write that way, other people will be able to bring this vision to life. But of course they can't. And Peter Moffat can. Maybe Graham Harper could have done, but Peter Moffat can't. And it does just look like... You can just see the panic and indecision in the actors and the cameramen. And what the hell's going on? Like, just people wandering in front of the camera from left to right and right to left. It's just nonsense. And the fast cutting and the short scenes doesn't improve the pacing. It just just gives you a headache. And it means that the scenes aren't long enough to have any characterization in them. I might come back to that in the next story, which I think is almost the complete opposite.
This story is about bringing back an old companion. So the first chunk of the story is all building up to the meeting of these two. And they finally meet, and of course the 5th Doctor has never met the Brigadier. So the Brigadier goes up to the Doctor, and it's this momentous moment, and the Brigadier says, "Well, who are you?" And it's played like a twist, like, why doesn't the Brigadier recognise the 5th Doctor? Well, he's never met him. And then scene cut. And you've been waiting for this moment. And then the rug's pulled out, and it cuts to something else. And so you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, that was like a big moment. And then, anyway, so next scene restarts. And the start of the next scene, we've missed the action. They've had their big reunion, except the Brigadier doesn't remember it. And the scene starts with us playing catch-up. with the Brigadier saying, "Oh, I'm very sorry if I don't remember you." We've missed the fun bit where the Doctor and the Brigadier have had the faltering reunion that doesn't work because of the amnesia.
Yeah, but we can't see that. It doesn't advance the plot, Gavin.
Well, you say that, but then we have to have that scene again because we missed it the first time. So it then plays out a second time on camera where they're back in the school having the same conversation with the Doctor presumably trying some of the same tricks, saying, well, don't you remember this and don't you remember this? Yeah, and then it labours to the point where it gets into the quarters and he gets his memory back. And I'm not sure, does the amnesia actually bring anything to the story? Because it lasts such a short period of time. Once he gets his memory back, he's just suffering from a typically uncertain memory from 6 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
He's lost the memory of the Doctor, but I can't see anything in surface of the plot. All it does is rob us of a beautiful reunion the first time that they meet. And we're even robbed of the misstep reunion because the action cuts away.
This has to do with the plot mechanics. Is that
Here's another question I've got for you then. So is he lying about that? Because he specifically says that he does remember not boarding the TARDIS. So is he lying to get on board the ship? Is he misremembering? Because either way, that scene's redundant. All it needs is for that uncertainty to remain, and the Brigadier just goes on board the ship in both years. Because it's explained away later, and the Doctor says, well, he insisted on coming with me as well. It isn't a plot point that he said, oh, but the Brigadier specifically told me he didn't come with you, so I knew it was safe to bring him. That's not the point. He just said, oh, well, he insisted. So that whole
wanted
scene
Tegan
could
to have a
go.
go at the Doctor there when the Doctor says, you blithering idiot, Tegan.
Yeah.
You...
Why do you not understand all the complicated laws of time, you idiot?
She
And
says, he
you'd have had
insisted
to have
on
known.
coming.
Yes.
And then when he says, well, he insists on coming with me as well, she...
Yeah, and she made
I
a
think she
decision
was slightly
first.
justified in...
Yeah.
And she's supposed to be gobby, but she isn't when she needs to be.
Tegan's generally really objectionable and is just a contrarian most of the time for the sake of it. But in this story, she's the voice of reason most of the time. It's one of the few occasions where she's entirely sympathetic because she's making all the right decisions, saying, don't trust Mordrin, don't do this, don't fly the TARDIS, don't let him out there. And because that's just her one-note character, is to just object to everything, it doesn't seem particularly extraordinary that she's just saying no to everything Nissa's suggesting, because Nissa's usually got a sensible plan of some kind.
The Brigadier, Tegan seems to make a big impression on the Brigadier, because here, when the Doctor mentions their name, he remembers. Yes, I remember. He's full of his memories of Tegan. Doesn't seem to remember anything about Nissa at all.
no?
And then this carries through into the Five Doctors, where when they all meet up again at the end in the Tomb of Rassilon, he goes to greet Miss Javanka ahead of Sarah Jane Smith, who we think he might have had a stronger connection with. So. There's a story there.
Yeah, what are you suggesting there, Paul?
Makes note. No, it doesn't matter.
Getting back to the pacing, I just thought, hang on, what are you going to fill episode 4 with? Because it really gets to all of the pieces are in play in the places they need to be by the end of episode 3. You've got everyone on the ship, and you've had the issue explained. I was thinking, okay, how are you going to pad this out for 20 minutes of episode 4 before the two Brigadiers can meet up? And
we all moan about the padding in episode 3s, but that's where it belongs. You don't want it in episode 4 when you're racing to your conclusion. Every time I watch it, I think, where's that awful bit with the terrible old age makeup with Tegan Nissa, and then
still to come.
Yeah, it's in a very weird place.
The end of episode 3 made me laugh so much. I couldn't think of another example where the threat at the end of the episode is a hypothetical situation, because it's a conversation where the baddies go, could you do this for us? And the Doctor says, no, because that would kill me. Roll credits! and it's just so bizarre. And I was thinking, like, because he's not being forced into it at that point, because that's the whole point of the aging of Nyssa and Tegan, is it forces his hand, so he has to acquiesce. But at the point where that jeopardy is proposed is at the end of episode 3, where there's been no mention of the fact that he'll have to do it. So Mordrin's saying, please help us. And the Doctor says, but if I do, it'll be the end of me as a Time Lord. And well, that's the equivalent of him going, but if I put my head in that meat grinder and turn it on, it might kill me. If I attach these electrodes to my nipples and turn on the current, that might really hurt. So maybe just don't do it. That would be my advice. It's just and it's literally the resolution at the start of episode 4. They go, oh well, let's not do that then, and they leave the room.
Yeah.
I want to say some nice things about this. So I do like the ideas, and that's why one of the reasons I always go and just think I'm going to enjoy it more than I do, because I always think, how could I not? It's got a public school and the Turlo and the Black Guardian and the Brigadier, and there's a really good science fiction plot, I think, and time travel shenanigans. I love time travel, except Tenet. By Christopher Nolan. Private joke. No,
Would you say this was more or less complicated than Tenet?
I think the only excuse I could possibly have for the writer and director here are that they were following Christopher Nolan's maxim of making everything as difficult to understand as possible. On this,
if it's not homework, it's not.
Because they don't want to patronise and underestimate their audience.
The only explanation. That's certainly true. The ending. I mean. The ending frustrated me so much because Peter Davison's Doctor is not the most. He doesn't have a great deal of agency a lot of the time, and he's a fairly passive character. But there are not. I couldn't think of another story that resolved itself absolutely perfectly by pure luck. Yeah. By the Doctor basically admitting defeat, handing himself over to the baddies, hooking himself up to the machine that he knew would basically end his life, and letting them flick the switch. And only by a 1,000,000,000,000 coincidence series of events did two people converge on the same spot who touch fingers at the right millisecond to deliver the power to save his life. I mean, it's extraordinary. But it was also frustrating from a narrative point of view, because at no point earlier had they just said, we need an enormous amount of power. It had always been very specifically about the Doctor's physiognomy, and they needed the secrets of the Time Lords.
And it was even
one
if
regeneration.
You think of it as regeneration energy that they need, it's specifically going to drain 8 times regeneration energy from them. So it's difficult to imagine how you can convert that.
Yeah,
into
and he said, well, it's the differential between 2 brigadiers meeting and the energy came from the TARDIS. And you thought, well, if it was that, why didn't you just get a big jumper cable from the TARDIS, rig that up? Yeah. So
a nuclear power station.
I mean, it's a bit of a worry.
So it's the old Artron energy, isn't it? The TARDIS is actually like some big old capacitor for Artron energy.
But I'd be curious to know if there's other stories where the Doctor has completely conceded defeat and just events in the universe align for no reason. It's nobody's fault. It's nobody's contrivance. It isn't the White Guardian steering things to help him. It's pure dumb luck. He's given up and his life saved. It's really disappointing.
And what do we think about that, though? More to the point, is it deliberate? Is it primarily aimed at showing just how noble the Doctor is? Is it Caves Vandrosani before its time, showing how much the Doctor will give up to help his friends?
But you can't have your cake and eat it. I mean, you can.
Because it doesn't feel like that, because it's not written as if the emotion of and the sacrifice, which again is...
Well, Tegan says thank you quietly at the end. I mean, what more do you want? They didn't do emotions in those days, did they?
It's a bit of a worry because, so you've already raised this issue about the millisecond either way, but there's also this issue that there's 8, well, there's Morgan and his 7 mates, so there's 8 of them, and the Doctor's got 8 lives left, so that's good. But what if there had been 9 of them? Or if there's 7 of them or 6 of them? I mean, what then?
Indeed.
Well, it's okay, because you've still got 2 lives left at the end of it, so that'll be all right, won't it?
I guess somebody at some stage, that the writer or scriptwriter thought that making a numerical comparison would make it clearer to the audience, but it doesn't. It just makes it seem...
But then you've got Tegan and Nyssa coming into the... So suddenly there's 10 of them, rather than 8 of them.
Oh, yeah.
So he's got to... So that's actually... It's a bit of a problem now. So I don't know. It feels like there's that, and then there's another thing earlier in the story where they sort of say, well, every 70 years we'd come close to the orbit of a planet. Well, why is it every 70 years? I mean, why is the universe isn't as regular as that? But also, you could come close to a planet sooner than that if you really wanted to, probably. It feels like there's a whole raft of those sort of duff ideas that don't really.
I tried to be nice about the plotting, the idea.
Well, you're fighting a losing battle, because I want to talk about this orbit. Where is it in orbit around?
Oh, look what you've done, Richard.
Because the story starts with
Dr.
the Doctor
Science
saying...
Mark II has taken over.
This ship is in orbit in time and space.
Oh, right, go on then.
And they talk about the whole thing at the beginning is that the ship is in orbit, but they never say what it's orbiting. And then suddenly the introduction of Earth is a bombshell after that. And then this thing comes up later that every 70 years it passes close to a planet and the Mordrin people can take on the shape. Presumably, it's really helpful if the beings that live on that planet aren't larger than the door of the capsule that they have to go up and down.
I assume that the planet is Earth all the time.
Oh, I see.
No. Mordrin's people say that the technology allows them to take on the form of whoever the natives of that planet are. So this is their one and only visit to Earth, is the suggestion in the script. It's on some
I felt
kind
like
of...
it was a time loop. I thought it was a bit like an time loop kind of thing. And
I wasn't sure about the implications of that because it went so quickly. But do we not see Mordrin before he's arrived on Earth? I mean, at what point does he take this?
We
shape?
first see him on the floor of the TARDIS, looking normal, like human, and that's because he's used the thing and then he's turned into a human in order to.
We see the sort of busts on the ship, don't we?
So if he's a shapeshifter, kind of, he could easily have changed to look exactly like Peter Davison if they hadn't already done it in Arc of Infinity. I've fixed this story. It's only taken 30 years, 40 years.
I mean, it's not explicitly said that it's done by their captors, but he says that every 70 years the ship passes by another planet. And he just sort of says, so that one of us can take the capsule down to Earth, take the form of the natives, and try to get help. And so, if framed in that, you've got to think that if he hadn't turned up all crispy, Mordrin would then have been kind of blundering around the school, presumably in...
his loincloth.
I don't know what costume, in his loincloth, yeah. Saying what? What help is he? What help are they
just
going?
Like Turlo, he'll be giving away.
Go to the headmaster and say, "Look, headmaster, I'm an alien from another planet," and the headmaster will go, "Well, you are in a pickle, aren't you?"
I tell you, that headmaster, he's more of an idiot than Hippo, so I'm not quite sure that we'd have got anywhere with him. Sorry, go on.
The headmaster, of course, is the original Barusa from. So, ironically, this story, which is set between Arc of Infinity and the Five Doctors, where we have two other Barusas, features the original Barusa. I don't know. I wanted to throw that in there, and now I'm wishing I hadn't been so keen to do so. Yes, for a story which is so often has too many specific details, like every 70 years we pass a planet, or there are 8 of us and 8 of your lives. It often throws in details where it doesn't help. But if we'd had any idea of the length of time these creatures have been travelling. I feel like that would have given it a bit of scope. We're told it's a long time and their search for immortality has just brought them an eternal suffering. But if they'd said we've been travelling this ship for 1 million years or 1 billion years or something, I don't know. A nice big number. That would have given it a sense of scale, but that's the one place where it's a bit vague.
How long have you been travelling? About 70 years.
I found David Collings' sad, dead, choking acting horribly uncomfortable and extremely tiresome, and I got bored of it very, very quickly, and then it just keeps going for episodes and episodes. I'm listening to him making mouth sounds like and it really started to make me feel a bit queasy after a while. And after that whole process, they'd gone through the whole rigmarole of is it the Doctor, isn't it the Doctor? And you thought, okay, at least we've left that behind. And he crawls back into the spaceship chamber and the Brigadier comes across him, and then the Brigadier goes, "Oh, Doctor," and you just think, "Oh, not this again." It's there's a lot of very tiresome aspects. I think it runs out of steam very quickly, and as you say, spins its wheels. But I was growing increasingly unhappy with the crispy, burnt makeup, and then it turns up on Nyssa and Tegan, and then there's patches of it all over the other people, and it's just the whole story is very oppressive and downbeat, and it's all about death. Yeah, it's about 8 guys who want to commit suicide and need the Doctor's help.
Without saying anything particularly profound. But then again, that is novel, isn't it? Do you not like the fact, on some level, that these aren't stereotypical villains? They're not particularly evil. They started off as amoral types who wanted to steal a technology that didn't belong to them, and there's something almost mythic, the stuff of great legend about that.
No,
but
it could going on as well.
Yes,
it's also heavily influenced by the work of Wagner.
They've got a virus as well.
Yes.
Yes.
which was a bit unfortunate for Tegan and Nyssa.
Yeah, it's funny that once again we got this whole immortality is a curse, kind of thing.
I thought that.
Yeah, you kind of got you're
Time
kind
Lord
of
technology.
revisiting Time Lord technology, and the fact we do this again in the Five Doctors. It's not a million miles away from Silver Nemesis and Remembrance and Silver Nemesis in terms of retreading some plot points in the resolution.
On the plus side, 20 years after Terry Nation tells us somebody the anecdote of the Georgian state dancers, we finally get these characters shuffling across stage in these long costumes, sort of gliding along, except that nobody seems to have told about half of them at the back.
Yeah, the ones at the back. That's definitely. Yeah, I was thinking they've practiced this, and then they've come a point where they've thought, we haven't got time to get them all working, so we'll just put you lot at the front and just trying to hide these idiots at the back who haven't quite got it. Yeah, the one at the front's really impressive.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I was watching them thinking, that's really nice and interesting, but why? Why? I mean, but let's just creatively give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they don't have human legs. Maybe they are like Colony Sarth, and they're just like a rolling mass of tendrils, and that's why they're so smooth. But then you see, no, they come down the steps later. They've just got legs. So they walk down steps normally, and they get to the bottom, and then they do the gliding, and it's like, well, that's an interesting choice. But yeah, they're aliens, so they just do alien things, don't they? Is that their brains showing in their heads?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Why?
I reckon.
How many times do we see it pulsating? Is it literally just the first time?
Early on. I think Mordrin's does it early on, and then they give up on the...
I think it's only Mordrin has the proper animatronic.
Yeah. But even he keeps forgetting to turn it on, a bit like the bloke who played
I think. Do you think he's pumping it with his own hand?
Yeah. I shouldn't admit this next bit because it just makes me look like I was an idiot when I was.
Sounds good.
When I was 10 watching this, but I remember thinking for some reason that episode 3 cliffhanger and into episode 4, where the Doctor's faced with the dilemma of losing his upcoming regenerations. I think my excuse is that I was coming to the point where I was becoming a real fan. I was really reading up on the history of the program and getting very into it. And a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I remember turning to my parents and saying, I've worked out where this story's going. He's going to give away his remaining lives, and he is going to become human, and then he'll stay on Earth again, you see, because just like the third Doctor used to stay on Earth, and that's where they're going to go. They're going to change the program.
Yeah, he'll be back with the Brigadier, like in the
I think my parents were very interested in that theory, I seem to remember.
Pat you on the head.
Yeah, with some force.
And if only they'd done that, then the program wouldn't have been cancelled in 2 years' time.
What if his parents had...
This is one of the stories that does a lot to reinforce the whole 12 regenerations limit. And I'm trying to think what happens in the interim, because obviously it comes in Deadly Assassin. Do we get much coverage of it in the meantime?
Good question. Is it even clear in the Deadly Assassin that he means 12 regenerations, 13 bodies, or is this the first time they make the distinction between those two?
Ooh, good question.
Well,
I have read an article on this in the past, and somebody's done the research for us, but...
I always, when I was younger, thought for some reason that the last body was not a fully working one. I don't know why. I always thought that the Master looked the way he did.
You thought that was his 13th body, not his 14th body.
I thought his final regeneration was just like when your battery's running out and it doesn't work very well. And so you just end up as a crispy mess. But
well, back to Mordrin and his mates again.
Yeah.
That could have been...
What I thought you were going to say about younger misunderstandings.
Oh.
When Mordrin turns round and his head's spaghetti, it's so weird that's right, that's normal, because the whole thing is about the mutation and disfiguration in the machine. First of all, it burnt into a crisp, and they're all worried about all mutations and everything going wrong. And so I've always been bewildered by the fact that he turns around and his brain's on show, and then you meet all his mates and all their brains are on show, and it's just confusing to me. It was confusing then, confusing now.
Yes, and what's supposed to have happened between when we first see him lying on the floor, and although he's in a bit of a state, his brain is where it should be, and the next scene?
Restorative properties of the TARDIS
Right.
returned him to his natural form.
And made his clothes grow back.
Yes. he says the atmosphere of the TARDIS.
Right. So his natural form is largely humanoid.
His natural form is a bloke with spaghetti on his head.
Is humanoid with an exposed brain.
Yes.
So the exposed brain is not part of the mutations that we've heard so much about.
That's my understanding, and that's what
this is
confuses
nonsense,
me.
So that's what happens when you're in a state of grace, is it?
Still, the music's good.
Okay, so when I wrote my notes for this,
Yeah.
the largest section I had was on the music, and I pared it right down. I mean, I don't have anything particular to say except I hate it.
Yeah, so do I.
It's horrible, it's ill-judged, it's distracting, it's too noisy, it cues on things that don't need music, it's horribly dated, and I think it's the worst thing about the story. And I was watching it today thinking it would be fun to take some Dudley Simpson music from something else he's done, like Blake Seven, which hits a lot of the Tom Baker era notes, and put that in instead and see how this story felt, because it gets off to a bad start with the infamous jaunty car music, doesn't it? Thankfully, that's about as bad as it gets, but it's so distracting and it's so inappropriate, and it undercuts any sense of intrigue and jeopardy, because it's all you're thinking about is, what am I hearing?
Do you not even like the flashback music?
That's all right, but it's just pervasive. I mean, yeah, the flashback music's all right, but there's just an over-reliance on it. If there was maybe 50% as much music in the episode. And the funny thing is, one of the most effective scenes is when the Brigadiers finally meet. And it's one of the few scenes with no music. And it's just got the 1983 Brigadier counting down, and the sound effect of the computer gets louder. And you have that sense of inevitability, because we've been told repeatedly how bad it is if the two Brigadiers meet, and the Doctor's about to die. And it's amazing. There's no music. And it's a beautiful bit, and I love it. And you just think how much more of the story would be improved if Paddy Kingsland just piped down.
I tend to think his music is even less successful with the present day, with the present day Earth stories. It just seems ludicrous there. Sometimes works in the futuristic ones. This score for Frontios is very similar to this.
Didn't he do Frontios, and that really works?
It really works very well, and it's very similar. But he's not got any. There's no ill-judged comedy moments. He doesn't get his guitar out. Like, is it Logopolis or Castrovalva where he's doing his?
Oh, the wah-wah guitar. I mean, that is a terrific piece of music, to be fair. But I'm not sure I want it in Doctor Who.
And I seem to remember Full Circle bit working well as well. So I don't know quite why it's so up and down. But on here and on the Visitation and so on, less so.
So how come we were so convinced that unit stories happened in the 1980s when nobody actually mentions any dates whatsoever in the whole of the Pertwee era?
Well, go on.
No, you tell us.
Well, I mean, there's an awful lot of near future technology, and I think the biggest example is in the Invasion. I mean, it's all about near future technology. You can't say the Invasion is set in the year it was made, so you've got to add a couple of years. And then you probably keep adding a couple of years. And then you got that in the back of your mind until, I think the two main things are female Prime Minister and Terror of the Zygons, which has to be Thatcher. I could appreciate that's retrospective, but that was not... It was an in-joke, but it was done as a possibility. But also then Pyramids of Mars, Sarah says she's from 1980, so that dates...
That's the biggest, and in my opinion, the most important
That dates the Time Warrior.
Everything else is completely arguable. I think it's more, frankly, that fans grew up reading behind-the-scenes interviews, knowing that the production team had intended the Pertwee years to be set in the future. But when you look at the on-screen evidence, 99% of it is clearly set. They've got, they've still got pre-decimal currency.
Isn't it a bit kind of strange though? I mean, so thinking about Sarah, because I mean, if I disappeared off in a time machine now, where would I say? Oh, I'm from 2021, or would I say I'm from 1967, or would I don't know. I mean, why is 1980 the last time that she was in, or was it?
Well, the fact, I mean, there are options, but both those options that you mentioned are from the past.
Yeah.
If you're saying that she would be from 1980 would at the earliest be when she was born, and at the latest be when she left Earth, which would still be a problem.
I think anyone would say the year they thought it is. So I think, like, if I was whisked off into time and space today and had a series of adventures and was to later complain about the Earth being ruined, I would say, oh, well, I missed the Earth from 2021. I'm from 2021, and it wasn't so ruined.
And
I wouldn't say I'm from 1979, because that doesn't feel real. I don't remember the year I was born. That feels totally illogical.
Sarah Jane is is more like the New Who companions than any other classic companion, because she keeps going back to Earth, and presumably time is progressing in real time outside the TARDIS, so she feels anchored still. For some reason, anchored in 1980. But she can't have been. She's from 1976, so she's an idiot. She's delusional. I'm sure somebody somewhere has written a short story that explains this discrepancy in a literal way, as opposed to all the wink-nudge attempts we've had more recently.
Very good. Well, there's the unit dating controversy to deal with.
Perhaps there's a missing episode in between.
Look, for my money, it's amazing how it divides people. People do get quite uptight, don't they? Everyone is either a 1970s or 1980s person, and there have been some horrendous battles fought at the Fitzroy Tavern over this. This point of great theological import. For me, I'm going to contradict myself here, because normally with Doctor Who you have to make so many allowances for the fact that it's a production, a work of fiction. Things that look a bit... Sutik didn't really have a hand on his cushion, and just to pick one at random. And things are... All of those, every single location we ever went to did have a fourth wall, unlike the one that we're presented with. So when I say that, these things are clearly the 70s. It's the 70s with some technology that the real 70s didn't have, as opposed to an 80s which looked exactly like the 70s in every respect, apart from the occasional bit of technology. You know, it's got to be one or the other. So while it's a production artifact that everything looks contemporary when it wasn't supposed to, it's enough to convince me that that's when they were supposed to be. And Mawdryn, for me, trumps Sarah Jane's hallucination about having come from the 80s. But does it really matter? Does it really matter? It must do, otherwise I wouldn't have just said all that.
I think the point, for me, the argument comes out of frustration at the decisions made rather than arguing over which is right. It's more an argument resulting from the fact that somebody made the decision to create the argument. And that's the frustration, is that I think it was relatively clear up until Mawdryn Undead made us ask the question. And that is just bloody mindedness on John Nathan Turner's part. And it didn't need to be like that. And it's just a contempt for the source material.
Yeah. The problem is, though, that even if they hadn't bollocks it up then, it would not still be all nice. It would not be nice and simple now.
No, but it wouldn't be any worse.
The two things I would point out are that Doctor Who is not set in the real world. From the very beginning, it's been set in a world of more advanced technology now. It's just, yes, they've set it in a few years ahead, but when you get to that point, the reality is never caught up. And this has not been fixed by the new series. They only made this worse because they keep stepping a foot into creating that world. The contemporary world now that we live in is not the future world depicted in the classic series, where people are going to, not just because we're not going to Mars, but because humanity is not aware of the existence of alien life. They have not had multiple encounters, and that glib line in Remembrance of the Daleks doesn't explain it. The new series has had to brush that under the carpet several times, sometimes on screen with cracks in time that are supposed to erase the whole of humanity's memories of the last 4 years of the programme. But it's happened again since then, hasn't it? Wasn't there another reset there seems to have been an unspoken reset at the start of the latest Chibnall era, when yet again nobody remembers the Daleks, which they should. So my point is, we know now is what year stories are supposed to be set in, because they helpfully tell us. They often put it on the screen. But that doesn't make it an easier credit to consistent timeline, which I think is the thing we're after. We're not after each discrete story to tell us when it is apparently set. We're after a timeline that makes some sort of narrative sense, and you can write a book about it, and it has a forward flow.
Yeah,
and that's been broken many times by outside the strict world of the unit stories.
Yeah, and I guess also what you're saying is that Enemy of the World doesn't really feel to be in the same time as the thing with the spiders set in Sheffield.
Indeed.
If in fact those were the same year, which they probably were.
And it's only going to get
worse,
isn't it?
Is set in 2020.
Yeah.
according to the trailer.
I'm not demanding somebody does something about this. I just wanted to say that, don't worry, guys.
I think that there's a big chunk of that by virtue of the nature of telling futuristic stories you can't avoid. But it goes back to what I was saying about the frustration comes from things that are avoidable. And it's avoidable for them to, according to Ian Levine, just listen to Ian Levine, who said that'll cause a whole load more problems. And they could have just not done that. I mean, how critical was the Silver Jubilee to that story? It wasn't.
It's a line, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think if this was being made now, the production team would make the same decision, and I think it's because I can hear Russell T Davies or Moffat saying, "Yeah, I wanted to anchor it in a big public event, and because these scenes are set in the past, I wanted it to be a public event that the viewers that actually was in the past, for the point of view of my viewers. If the past scenes were set at Charles and Diana's wedding, and the present scenes were set 4 years in the future." Which is what you would have had to do, to shift it. At the least you'd have had to do to stick with the Sarah Jane 80s version. Then people get very confused about what was supposed to be past and present and future. So I think they would have. I think any showrunner in any era would have said, this will make it clearer for the audience, the mainstream audience, than sticking to the show's internal chronology.
But that's the irony, isn't it? Is that this episode wasn't made for the mainstream audience. It was made to wallow in fan.
It's trying to do two things at once.
We've hit the point at which I think we need to shift gear.
Yeah,
and I think
it's a slight problem because I thought I'd have more to say about human nature. So
yes,
this could.
Yeah,
oh,
so I mean, I'll give you 5 minutes to finish this one off, but I think that we then.
Oh
have
God,
to move
no!
on.
Don't. Let's move on.
The last thing I'll say is that the Fifth Doctor has no duty of care for young Brig, does he? Basically, they ditch him in 1977 faster than you can imagine,
knowing they've ruined his life for 6 years.
Exactly. And say, well, thank goodness we got rid of him. We don't have to worry about that anymore. Some other poor sod can look after him. And then they also dump the old Brig off as well and disappear without a care, really. So it's all a bit of a perfunctory ending. Enya Road, Human Nature. Human Nature, written by Paul Cornell, from the book of the same name, although that, of course, was a new adventure with the Seventh Doctor and Ace. It's from Series 3. It's directed by Charles Palmer. Paul Cornell is almost exactly the same age as me, so I guess that means he's going to have a sort of similar memory of the sort of same stories about the same time. This is a story that's also set in a public school, but it's a very different kind of public school. I guess it's set in history rather than contemporary, and it's a very different kind of story. I mean, who wants to have a crack at it?
It's brilliant,
isn't it? Just
I think the first episode is damn near perfect, and the second episode is not far off.
Mm-hmm.
It's beautifully balanced. The human drama is pitch perfect. The performances are amazing. Jessica Hines is wonderful. Harry Lloyd as Baines. I don't know how he's not gone on. I mean, I know he was in things, but he's a lead if ever I saw one. Rebecca Staten, I thought she was absolutely fantastic. The structure is superb. It weaves all its elements together. I was struck. I'd kind of forgotten how well the themes all worked about war, pacifism, cowardice. All of the characters' stories paid off. I really, really enjoyed watching it today. There were a few slight issues in second episode, but nothing major. I was a bit disappointed when the character of the Doctor returned. I really enjoyed David Tennant underplaying rather than his usual scenery chewing.
Yeah, I think of all the times that they've written in an opportunity for the lead actor to play something different and show their range, I think this is probably the most impressive, isn't it?
You felt real sympathy.
It's genuinely another character rather than just a gimmicky.
And he had thoughts and opinions that were different to the Doctor, and he resented the Doctor, and that's so interesting. I thought that was beautifully played, beautifully written.
Yeah. Like you say, the second episode lives up to the first, which isn't always the case with the two-parters nowadays, and maybe it's because it comes from a book, so it had that benefit of having been very strongly plotted to start with, whereas perhaps sometimes when something's been written for TV, I don't know. The temptation is to...
Who has read the book?
I have, but I borrowed Big Finish writer Rob Morris, no relation's copy, so I don't have it myself, so I couldn't go back and check it. So I was hoping one of you had read it more recently and could answer some questions for me.
I sadly never read it, and I considered it, but I didn't.
Sadly, I think this was just after I dropped out of reading them.
Richard, I know for a fact, hasn't read it does he said it has Ace in it. It doesn't. It has Bernice Summerfield.
It's Benny, yeah.
But,
Very good.
Wow, gracious in
I
defeat.
think I read the one directly before it, so...
So there's none of that unrequited love business with Bernice, of course. I can't remember. I couldn't go and read it, but I suppose I could have at least read a summary.
I was going to read the summary, but...
Yes. So it's set not in a school, but a college for training military officers. So it has a slight advantage in that the themes are woven slightly more tightly. But because of the setting, 1913, it's certainly not overly contrived, is it, to keep the Anthem for Doomed Youth angle. So, yes, that's one of the main changes, but possibly not particularly serious. It's changed to a school rather than a college. I have no idea why that was done. Has anyone done any research to look into the changes that were made? It simplifies the book. There are some major characters that are removed.
I think it's interesting only that in 2007 when this came out, it wasn't such a big deal. But of course, now that our country is run by public school boys, it sort of feels that there's a whole narrative, in watching it that kind of feels a lot more relevant to today than it did back then.
I was going to say something very similar, that believe it or not, when this was made, we lived in something that rather more closely resembled a meritocracy, without wishing to get it too much into the politics. But these people in their little penguin suits were largely, it was like a historical curiosity.
Mm.
People viewed it as, and then we've had a decade of being run by them. Once again, they have resurrected themselves.
I wonder if it was made now, whether Russell would lean into that, whether he'd
Paul Cornell definitely would
crank up the misbehaviour and make references to the Dullingford Club or something like that.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting, obviously we'll come on to this again in terms of this sort of elegiac, however you pronounce it, kind of thing. This was made, interestingly, it was before the, stated bleeding obvious, before the centennial commemorations of the First World War, and at a time when the last of the veterans were actually, the last of the First World War veterans. And I was just looking, Harry Patch died in 2009, so this was the time when it was in the public conscience that the very last people who had actually fought in the war were dying off.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even then we possibly had a different view of it from Remembrance Day and stuff like that than perhaps we have again now that it's become part of this kind of being embroiled into this culture war. Poppy fascism kind of thing.
I thought we probably wouldn't have that end scene now. It's too divisive.
Yeah.
Which is sad, really, but that's where we are. It's been weaponized.
Mm.
Although First World War may be slightly less than Second, but I know what you mean.
But I think you couldn't do it without, you'd open a big old debate about it, which at that time, you could, you weren't really opening a can of worms by addressing that.
Mm.
And a lovely one other thing I did notice that was a lovely touch, and I didn't actually take it at the time. I did a double take because when I saw the poster for the dance, or the invitation for the dance thing, and my initial thing, I sort of saw November 1913. I thought, hang on, is there some Doctor Who anniversary related gag there? But of course, then it's actually that the dance is on, and the events of that night is the 11th of November, 1913. So it's It's like the preemptive Armistice Day.
I thought you were going to point out that the typography on the sign was anachronistic because the font hadn't been invented in 1913. You geek!
But yeah, in general, I'd just echo what everyone else has said. It's absolutely superb story. And I think possibly one of the absolute best two-parters, certainly that the series is. I mean, this is series 3 is my favourite series of New Who in general. Anyway, and I think this is probably one of the best two-parters in that it actually manages to be a coherent two-parter, and it doesn't have to pull any tricks of let's have a sudden change of pace, let's do a jump forward, jump forward in time, let's do anything else. It's just it's got the right amount of plots. It's got a subject matter that has got the moral heft, as it were, and it's a weighty subject matter that deserves to be a two-parter.
Because that's the thing. Good Doctor Who stories work on multiple levels, and it has a theme. And even good Doctor Who stories don't always have a theme. They persist through other methods, and this is really nice that it gives you something to chew over. The Doctor's failure to pull the trigger against the Scarecrows, and him obviously questioning his nature, I suppose. There's all kinds of interesting stuff, and it's nice to just sort of be asked questions rather than be told what to think. And there's a lot of good stuff. It's curious, isn't it, that this and Blink and Caves of Androzani, a lot of what are considered the best of Doctor Who are atypical Doctor Who stories, because human nature is as unusual as they come. And Doctor Who's always kind of, whilst it is a very varied format, it is also often a very well-trodden template. And some very templated stories are pretty good and enjoyable. But it's the ones that break all the rules and do something really weird and confusing. And so if you were to tell people what a great Doctor Who serial is, show them Blink, well, it hasn't really got the Doctor in, or show them Caves of Androzani, where everyone dies and the Doctor... the Doctor doesn't affect any positive change. It's just drug dealers and machine guns and sadness from start to finish. And somebody will come to you and say, "Well, I didn't realise Doctor Who was such a pessimistic and depressing series." Well, so Human Nature, another one in the oddball category, doing extremely well.
For me, that this entire six episode outrun, the tail end of series 3. It's and I really like the Master trilogy that ends it as well. I mean, Utopia has its shonky moments, but is kind of made up for by the third act, it feels like, and then I have a lot of time for Sound of Drums and Last of the Time Lords, which again are very, very far from typical.
Yeah, I was going to say that as well. That it is one of the best runs of stories ever, and I hadn't really spotted it that all of them are atypical. So it's cheating, really, isn't it? If they'd stuck a typical Doctor Who story in there, it would have broken the spell. Any idiot can produce a absolute work of art just by being different.
I mean, first 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes of episode 2, I suppose, is technically a base under siege story, but it doesn't persist, and it's not really the point.
It's so difficult to say. To talk. I thought I was going to have a lot to say about this, but because it's so good, but it's difficult to find things to say when things are. Half the things I want to say are by comparing it to stories that don't work, that do similar things that don't work as well. I mean, you said how well paced it was, Gav, and it is. It's emblematic to me of one interesting thing about the pacing of New Who. There are a lot of single episode stories that don't work for me because they try and cram too much story in. But then some of the two-parters don't add any extra plot. They tell a story that's barely any more complex than a one-parter, but just go into it with more depth, which I think is why over and over again viewers at the time would say they found them more satisfying. They rarely, I suppose, until Moffat takes over, he starts doubling and tripling the amount of plot the longer the story gets. But here, this is unusually linear, really. There aren't even any subplots. It just allows us to get into this, to tell this one story really well and bring the themes out, the big themes and the small themes, where it's just about two people.
I suppose if something's skillfully enough written, then you end up with subplots that don't feel like subplots. because ultimately you can. I mean,
yes,
it's an alien invasion story, but that's not really the story. It's about the Doctor's love affair and the problems that causes for the alien invasion. So you kind of have an A and a B plot, but they're not separated.
Yeah, exactly. Subplots don't have to take place in separate strands. They can.
Yeah.
You can have all your characters stuck in a lift and still have multiple subplots if the interactions are.
It's not like one of those horrible sitcom B stories where they don't have anything for one character to do, so they go off and have a wacky side adventure.
And that's why we don't end up with everyone splitting up and running around the village or just running around the corridors in the school to frenetic lack of avail, as with Mordrim.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost in this story as if the Doctor's being deliberately cruel to Martha, because he could hide anywhere in the cosmos, but he finds a place to hide that's going to make it awkward for her, and gives her a pretty unpleasant role to have to undergo for several months. And then he goes and falls in love with somebody else when he knows that she's in love with him, and so that's sort of problematic as well. And yeah, I mean, in the end, she has a thoroughly miserable time for as long as it lasts, and yet she then. She sort of seems happy enough when he sort of springs back into his normal character.
Does he know that she's got the hots for him? Because at the end, when she admits it and then hopes that he won't remember her saying that, the implication is that he's been blissfully unaware of this throughout the season so far. I wasn't the biggest fan of that story, and I think it pays off here. Because I do love the fact that two moments. I mean, I do, for the first time, feel sorry for Martha when... She gets a lot of corny lines, Martha, and but the line, "You had to fall in love with a human, it wasn't me." I remember rolling my eyes a bit at the time, but now I thought I just really my heart went out for her.
I did roll my eyes a little bit because it didn't need saying. Cause,
there's that.
Because you say it in your head.
Yeah.
Just before she says it, you say, "But it wasn't you," and then she says, "Oh, but it wasn't me." And you think if you're saying it to yourself, the character doesn't need to.
Better than that is the fact that the Doctor hasn't anticipated that he might fall in love. He's lived off his exhaustive list of things that might happen.
Yeah.
And John Smith's horror, you think when he's trying to understand why this man, that he's been asked to sacrifice his life to bring back this man, the Doctor, and everything he's hearing about him just makes him think, why is this man worth more than me? He sounds awful. And it makes us think as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the 10th Doctor is the one to do this with, because he is... I suppose it works really well with the 7th Doctor in a different way, but 10 is getting into that megalomaniac
He's the Jim Kirk of Doctor Who, isn't he? He's got a girl in every port, sort of thing.
A girl in every fireplace.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I wasn't really thinking that. So bearing that in mind, that he is a bit kissy-wissy for a Doctor, why does he not think he might fall in love? Because that's the point. None of these were romantic relationships.
Yes, I suppose that's it. He hasn't ever fallen in love.
He doesn't see it that way.
No, he's fallen in
very
lust
strong
a few times
with good-looking ladies. Did you pull a face, Gav, when I mentioned the 7th Doctor? Or was it something else I said?
No, I was thinking of a really unpleasant, different image that wasn't Sylvester McCoy kissing Jessica Hines.
I'm fairly sure the love story isn't in the book, but again, I didn't bother to check. Joan Redfern is a suffragette and part of a slightly larger ensemble cast in the novel. But it's good that they changed it, because it means we can have both in the continuity without upsetting the sort of people who would worry about that, like me.
Was it a sordid romance in the book between the Doctor and Joan?
I think so, yes.
There is there? Okay. I'm misremembering.
I don't know. I can only say, according to what I read on the summaries, trying to read up on it. Yes, the romance subplot is... But that seems like an odd thing to...
It's a new series, is Sharda, isn't it? Where you've got sort of several different versions in different media with different Doctors, and, we're happy enough.
I can't remember what the scientific explanation for the Doctor rewriting his DNA is in, but it's not a chameleon arch, I know that. The aliens are different, so that is another reason why we can have both these coexisting. They're the Obertides, which have some very interesting properties. I think they reproduce in little pods, I think.
which will be handy for Mordrin, their physical, like things like clothes and things, are an extension of themselves, I believe. And apparently that was carried over to the early drafts of the scripts. They were going to have Martha become suspicious of Jenny when she recoiled in pain at having something spilt on her handbag or something.
Interesting.
That's good.
Like that.
They are very nasty in the way that
And
Paul
then they
Cornell...
decided it wasn't visual. Sorry?
I was just saying the villains are very nasty in the way that Paul Cornell villains in his books always are. They're very witty, they're very cruel, and just generally scary and unpleasant. And that carries through. There's definitely... Russell T Davies has said, I believe, that he rewrote a lot of this. Has he said this publicly? He must have done.
Yes. Well, yeah. I believe he. I think it kind of comes. It kind of comes from something where someone was bemoaning people.
Yeah.
I think he was bemoaning the fact that people love this, slag off some of his
and that it
stuff,
won so many
then,
awards.
It won an award.
And it possibly the suggestion was Russell might have
had
perhaps shared in that
written one or two
award.
lines.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there. But the point is that regardless of how much he wrote, Paul Cornell's influence does shine through, and not just obviously because it's all the ideas come from him, but I think the tone comes from him. And Russell, of course, has always said that, hasn't he? That he was very good at keeping, even if he rewrote every word, he would keep the tone and the intent intact, unless it was shit.
Well, from what I can read from the summaries, I know this is something where it does feel like, okay, that's something that they did rather better on. That in the book, the Doctor just goes to some genetic manipulator guy because he's unable to, because Benny is grieving for her boyfriend who died in the previous book, the Knight.
Right, I've forgotten that.
Sanctuary is the one that comes before this.
Yeah.
And it ends with Benny's boyfriend dying, and the Doctor, at least according to the summaries, decides to have himself changed into human because he can't understand grief on a human level. So it's a sort of empathy exercise.
Yes, it is starting from a completely different place, isn't it? Yeah.
So I think folding it into the threat plot. Let's not call one the A plot and one the B plot, but I think unifying the two rather than having two separate things is a smart move and an improvement in terms of tightening it up to fit into 90 minutes of television.
I don't think it's impossible to take the original idea and do it on television, but it's a bit cerebral, isn't it? A bit conceptual, and I think it would take longer, and you might risk losing your casual audience.
So young Timmy Latimer and his sort of curious sense. I mean, does that ever get explained? It seemed to me that it was a bit difficult to follow.
I was waiting for the explanation and didn't come.
That was one of my small grumbles, was that just went by the wayside. But I kind of don't mind.
No, I mean, it's okay. We can have unexplained. It's true.
I mean,
I don't mind. I'm also surprised it doesn't get a.
What's his face in Planet of the Spiders? There's never any.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
The ESP exists in Doctor Who, so.
On the other hand, let's get Thomas Brodie Sangster back if we can afford him. And do a follow up with him now. Why not?
Yeah.
He was very good in Queen's Gambit.
He was TV's Thomas Brodie Sangster. Still with his little baby face, even though I was thinking he must be well into his 30s now, but he still looks about 12 every time I see him. Down the shops, every time I see him,
There's also two characters in this one mentioned and one actually in it who've served in the Boer War. So I mean, I suppose that's a relatively recent event for the characters in the story, but I don't know. I mean, it's a war, I suppose, that people probably volunteered to take part in. It's not. I don't perhaps know my history well enough. I hadn't imagined it had had such a large impact on the populace in general.
Never mind real life. Let's talk about the science fiction. This chameleon arch, right, which is invented as an alternative, as a more visual way of getting across the science fiction mechanism, the Doctor changing. That's at a longer life than you would have thought, hasn't it? Because first Russell brings it back in the 2 stories later.
Well, it's a brilliant conceit to come up with it, and then
he sees there's some extra potential in it
for
his master reveal. And then it seems to have had quite this. In fact, this story in general seems to have had quite an impact on Chibnall because the Ruth Doctor is hiding. Is it explicitly a chameleon arch? It's not in a fob watch, but most I
It's a
think
chameleon.
pretty much everything, all the same iconography is used to explain how she's been hidden. And then in the first episode of the season finale, the most recent season finale, we get pretty much there's a subplot which is pretty much a retelling of Human Nature, isn't it? About it has some of the same atmosphere, the chap in Ireland. Now, I'm going to ask somebody to remind me what on earth all that came to, because I can't remember who he was. But the bloke who grows up working in the
allegory,
a rural police.
Yeah, the suggestion is that it's the Doctor's distorted memories of his undercover work for Celestial Intervention Agency. No, they're called something else. What are they called?
Them anyway, yes. Yeah. But yes, it's certainly got similarities there, hasn't it?
And the thing about Gallifrey being a place in Ireland.
Yes. It is mostly predicated on that one line.
Yes.
Now I come to think of it.
One thing I put in my notes.
Yeah.
Drama is satisfying when characters aren't stupid. And you think that would be a fairly straightforward rule for scriptwriters to follow. And it is so rarely observed that it really jumps out when characters, both good and bad, are intelligent and make reasoned deductions that don't leave you screaming at the television. And the villains do it throughout. Family of Blood are on the ball, and it works really well because they feel like a threat. Because, as you said, Paul, they're intelligent, and their dialogue is witty and interesting, and they feel like a worrying bunch because they're obviously fairly smart, and that works really well. And that's such a simple thing, is to make your antagonist a genuine intellectual threat, or at least not an imbecile, because so many Doctor Who villains are confounded by them just missing obvious things. And the same was true of Martha. The scene in particular that stood out, I mean, she's on the ball all the way through this story, although she's making slightly ill-judged decisions in difficult circumstances. But by and large, everyone behaves like a normal human being, and that really it's really striking when you're not screaming in frustration at a piece of drama because people are acting like you think that's what I'd do in that situation. And the bit where Martha sits down with her former colleague, and her former colleague is being a bit weird, and it's the kind of weirdness that 9 times out of 10 in Doctor Who the protagonists don't notice.
Yeah, Rosie and Mickey.
And somebody's being weird, and they go, "Are you all right today, mate?" And you go, "Yes, I am fine. I have not been possessed by an alien menace." "All right, okay, I'll go and make a cup of tea then." But Martha does that beautiful thing where she just throws some weird stuff. Shall I put some pork chop in the teapot? And her friend goes, "Yes, that'd be lovely." It just doesn't need explaining, and it's just such a simple thing that in a more ordinary script that would be so overwritten and so over-explained, and it's just a nice little subtle detail, and I liked it. And there's a lot of that all the way through, is people behaving like you would hope people behave, and it's such a basic requirement of TV drama, and it so often fails to be met. So it was lovely, and the dialogue is genuinely really sharp pretty much all the way through, and there's a lot of minor characters that makes some really interesting. I really like the bit where is he called the headmaster? He bursts in and he says, "What are you all up to?"
Yes.
And that's a really nice scene because, again, in other more standard things, somebody would fail to properly explain, and he'd say, "Oh, this is ridiculous," and John Smith would stumble over his words, and he'd say, "Oh, get rid of all this," and he'd say, "Joan, what's going on?" And Joan wouldn't back the Doctor up, and you'd be screaming in frustration.
Yeah.
But no, people behave like you would hope people behave, and it's just those notes of, I'm really trying not to say verisimilitude, but there, I've said it.
Yeah, and I like the character of the headmaster because
Pip Torrens, very good.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, he's got enough imagination to sort of see that maybe there's something going on that's definitely weird, but not kind of impossible. I mean, he falls over in the end simply because he isn't prepared to accept that a small girl could be a threat. But up to that point, as you say, he's acted relatively intelligently and not being a blimp.
He's not a sympathetic character. We're not supposed to like him.
No.
He's representing all the things that the subjects of this story are telling us we need to move away from. But, as you say, in lesser hands, he would have been written as an idiot or made unreasonably objectionable.
Mm.
And neither of those things is true. I'm looking here at the cover of the book, which is a very arresting image of a schoolboy firing a machine gun, with the doctor helping load the bullets. And it reminds me that imagery is central to both versions.
Mm.
And although we obviously know what it's implying, that this is the presaging the future for many of these boys, but the specific imagery of schoolboys firing machine guns in a school, does that come from the Lindsay Anderson film If?
I was going to say.
Now, I've not seen that, but I feel like I feel like everybody knows the famous Lindsay Anderson's If, with its famous climax of a machine gun fight in a boys' public school. So I'm always comparing things to If and suggesting pastiching it in scripts, and nobody ever takes me up on the offer. Has anybody else seen it, or are we all just in the same position of knowing that it exists? And I'm just wondering if these references go beyond the superficial, because I don't really know what it's about.
You picked the wrong bunch of people to have that kind
Giles
debate
started off very promisingly by
No, I feel like it's a big gap in my knowledge that I've never seen it myself. But
balls.
But certainly the whole thing with the machine gun and Malcolm McDowell looking very similar to Baines and people like that is in the tiny collars.
There must be a link, because it's called If ... which presumably is a reference to Kipling's famous poem If You Can Do X, Y, and Z, Bob's Your Uncle.
Right.
Yeah.
That's Alan Partridge's paraphrase of If, by, for anybody who missed.
Literally the only reference that I have to that. If you do X, Y, and Z, Bob's your uncle.
Yeah.
If that was in an Alan Partridge film, that would be one of those moments where I would be the only person in cinema who would laugh at that. That would be my level, and I would live to regret it. Well, good.
And it is set back that's set in the 60s. That's contemporary, that film, rather than being historical.
Mm.
Yeah.
And it's more to do with
I think it's
teenage rebellion.
Yeah, I think it's just a visual reference, because it's a very striking idea, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
And it's never failed in any of the many contexts in which it's been pastiched. This is the only one.
So the family of blood, they travel through all of time and space to find the Doctor.
Every 70 years.
And then by accident they happen in the right place, but then they sniff him out. But maybe they go to lots of places very quickly.
But didn't they only have 3 months left to
Yeah.
live? I think there is a jumble in the plotting. I mean, unless I've missed something.
Yeah, okay. Is the Doctor hiding in the hope that if he just hides for 3 months,
Yes,
they'll be dead, and
that's
that's
what
the
he
problem
says.
over?
Yeah.
Which means that they're not travelling through time after him.
They
are travelling.
They are, because
They
they
say
know.
so.
In which case...
Yeah. Why didn't they hop 3 months forward?
Because they know about 1914, so they're not from.
That's
It's,
true. They say they've seen many...
I believe they start off in 2007 as well.
Right.
So, Alien 2007, but 2007.
It's not explained how they find him, is it?
Oh, well.
I don't think so.
Unless they are just very rapidly in a scattergun attempt, turning up places, having
That
a
makes no
sniff.
sense. They must be following the trail of his
Well,
TARDIS.
I mean,
They
let's
must-
face it, he's always going to Earth, so I suppose it's a pretty good bet, isn't it?
They've got a stolen vortex manipulator. I know that.
Hmm.
That's thrown in there as a line.
I think my biggest problem with this story is that and the ending, because I don't feel that they marry up either in their sort of moralizing or in their tone. I mean, we're shown this humble and compassionate John Smith,
Yeah.
and then we're given the Doctor to contrast with this, but the contrast is so outrageous because he surely only had to outwait their demise if he was waiting this 3 months. But instead of continuing he concocts this plan to trap them in eternal torture.
Yeah.
And they would not otherwise have been eternal. They were
No.
seeking immortality through
Yes.
stealing Time Lord biology, which incidentally is a nice link back to Mordred Undead.
Yeah, and indeed the Five Doctors, yeah.
Yes. But the ending seems so disproportionate to the compassion that we'd seen throughout the story. And also this reveal that he's endangered all these people,
Yes.
and that all these people have died for the sake of him just trying to spare the lives of these aliens, and all these humans ended up dying instead. I mean, who knows how many people died. The bombing of the village I found surprisingly shocking, because I didn't remember that at all. That's some fairly apocalyptic alien weaponry landing on the village, so a lot of people died in this story, and it was all for the sake of the Doctor not having to kill the family of Blood, because they say what his plan was to be kind to them and not kill them. He was just going to wait out their 3-month expiry date, and he decided instead of finishing them off, to wait them out, and that resulted in countless deaths. And then he imprisoned them for all time anyway. I mean, it's a really jarring conclusion to an otherwise heartfelt story about what is the best in people and how to avoid conflict, and there is another way. It's a really, really weird ending, and I think that's a misstep.
I don't want to say, but isn't that the point? But sort of, isn't that the... And, the fact that the Doctor is possibly being a coward by by trying to duck his responsibilities of taking these creatures on, and we don't really get a picture of quite how dangerous they are, and whether he's trying to duck the feeling that he has to do this thing. He doesn't want to be responsible for their deaths, so he'd rather imprison them forever. Or I don't know, but certainly with regards to the hypocrisy and so on, and Joan calls him on it, at the
Everybody
end
does.
anyway, when he asks her to.
John Smith,
Well, yes,
before he knows
he's-
the Doctor, he's got his number.
Yeah.
And Joan, after she meets him,
And he is meant to be, we are in this lonely god phase of
yes,
how we're
but
meant to interpret the Doctor.
is this where it starts? Though that's what I was going to ask. Is this a hangover from the No Second Chances? I'm that sort of a man from the Christmas Invasion, which has kind of mostly disappeared until now. He's not actually then been that sort of a man very much.
No, true.
But this is that resurfacing, or is it presaging where he's going to end up through the fourth series and beyond? I'm unsure.
Yeah.
It does seem to stick out a bit, really, because it feels to me that the 10th Doctor's era starts and ends with him getting a bit carried away with himself, doling out punishments, doling out justice as he sees fit from his elevated vantage point. But in the middle, where we are, it does stick out a bit.
I just find those series of melodramatic punishments that he concocts are really incongruous, because I mean, he's got umpteen time tricks up his sleeve, and they only had a 3-month expiry date.
I almost feel like you're not supposed to take them literally, because we do hear about it in voiceover.
Yeah.
They're so
Yeah, like the stuff of legend almost.
Yeah.
But they're being told to us by one of the
Yes,
family
indeed.
of Blood, so we
there's
know.
no suggestion it isn't true, but the way it's presented gives it a...
Yeah, it reminded me a bit of the Big Finish, the Sandman.
But then I always also thought that my reading of it at the time, and I guess on this thing too, is also, isn't the Doctor taking revenge for, isn't it? He is being petty, and he is taking revenge for the fact that he's been made to give up. There's a subtext of his.
Perhaps he doesn't seem that bothered.
I intuited it that he was taking revenge at the fact he'd sort of been made to give up this possibility of another life, and perhaps taking revenge for John Smith's, the loss of that
I
possibility.
don't get that. I think he's completely
Disinterested in the life of John Smith.
Yep.
He seems to have no regrets.
Could you change back? Yes. Are you going to? No.
Nah, got better things to do.
Yeah. It's a bit like the opposite of Pyramids of Mars, isn't it? Because there he takes a guy who's almost eternal and ages him to death in a few seconds, and here he's taking people who would die in a few weeks and slowing down the aging process to such an extent that it's never going to happen, but they're still stuck in the corridor forever.
It's certainly thought-provoking.
But on the other hand, haven't we? And I guess we have to take this out of it's the old authorial intent or whatever, but hasn't during the lockdown various optional extras and things that we were given during lockdown, hasn't Cornell written a follow-up or a sequel to this that has some redemption for, I think, at least the little girl in the mirror? As a little short 13th Doctor story where she releases her.
Don't know. Has he?
I believe this has been his, and there's been certain.
What about a balloon?
There's been certain things where he went a bit too,
That's very Moffat as well, isn't it? She's in
him having gone too far.
He imprisoned her in a mirror, every mirror. That's very Moffat. Somebody's been paying attention.
Yes.
I mean, she wasn't a little girl. That's the important thing to remember.
But
we shouldn't feel sorry for her because she's a little girl. Because she isn't. She's just in the...
Yeah, she killed a little girl.
Yeah, she's in the form of one.
Pip Torrens made that mistake.
Yeah.
Have we got much more to say?
Yeah, but I've forgotten it.
Well, we'll leave it for another 2 or 3 minutes to see if it comes back.
I mean, it was dynamite, naturally, but...
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we should start trying to work out if there are any links between these two stories, because I'm buggered if I can see any.
Can I just... One other thing I did want to say about was...
Yeah.
I've remembered what I was going to say.
Okay, well, we'll Giles first and then
Write
Gav.
it down, Gav.
Right.
Fine. It's all about Giles.
I like... Well, I thought... Obviously, Jessica Hines is fantastic throughout, but I liked some of the stuff with her character where she's... I thought it's interesting that there's moments where she is doctorish, and I thought with especially the bit where they go to the cottage and her thinking, the fact that she has figured it out. So I thought that was quite... Right. It's quite dark, the reason that she knows that cottage might be safe.
Yeah.
Is because that's where the little girl used to live, and so she's probably killed her parents.
Yeah,
and I thought that's quite a...
She's definitely passed the test for companion, but she's not interested.
Gav.
Mother of mine, she gets crushed into a collapsing galaxy. So as an astrologer, I was going to get you to talk about collapsing galaxies. Their scientific merit.
I remember that was a sitcom by the bloke who wrote Rent-A-Go, wasn't it?
So what's a collapsing galaxy? How do they work? And how would you be trapped and or killed by one?
God knows. Could be a quasar. Well, yeah. It could just be a terminology for a quasar or something with a supermassive black hole putting stuff in. I don't know. Wouldn't put in the whole galaxy unless it got really out of hand. But in theory, obviously, I guess you would be. That's the question. Do you disappear into the black hole, or are you trapped forever on the event horizon?
Probably one of RTD's rewrites that.
It could be dodgy because the thing is, in theory, you disappear into the black hole, but the last light from you is left on the event horizon.
And you might meet Omega in the black hole.
And you might meet Omega, yes.
And then untold trouble erupts.
Absolutely. He's an exiled Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey. She's a walker. She's a member of the family of blood. When they met, it was Moida.
Okay.
Mrs. Omega. Well, we nearly had Mrs. Meglos, didn't we?
So, Gav, you came up with one of the links I got around the stealing the essence of Time Lord in order to gain immortality. So both Mordrin and the family of blood. Go on.
That it turned out that immortality was a curse and not a blessing.
Yeah.
In both stories.
In both stories.
We're not talking about 5 Doctors.
Go on.
But yeah, my point still stands.
Yeah. In both stories, the Doctor tries to run away, but he can't escape. Well, he could escape if he actually didn't care too much about Tegan and Nyssa, but it turns out that he does, so he can't run away.
Both he ends up sacrificing himself. He's prepared to sacrifice himself.
Or
at least. In both stories, oddly enough, there's this threat of him changing from a Time Lord to a human. Because it may be metaphorical in Mordrin Undead, but he chooses to make his fate sound more dramatic by saying, if I use up all my remaining regenerations, I won't be a Time Lord anymore. Which is... There you go. That's a funny one, isn't it?
Spaceship explodes in both of them.
Yes.
Yep.
Very true. And apparently, teaching at a boys' school can cause you to lose your memory.
Why does the spaceship explode in Mordred Undead? I mean, the Doctor says the spaceship is dying with them.
Mm.
But you also think the whole quest was to die.
Hmm.
If they could have, rigged the engines to explode, if that ship had blown to smithereens, would they?
Yeah.
Would they?
But I
have
suppose,
all,
well, maybe the issue would have been
looped
that
back together?
if it had done that, they'd have still have been immortal, but they wouldn't have been in Art Deco luxury.
No, it'd have just been bits floating around. Sadly,
Not so much fun, maybe.
Presumably that's how the castrons or whatever they were rigged it to work, so it would blow up afterwards if they ever got tidying up after themselves.
They're very forward thinking.
And then, I mean, this is perhaps a little bit more tenuous, but I've linked the famous Mordrin flashback sequence and the Journal of Impossible Things in Human Nature.
No,
nice.
that's a very good one, because it's the first decent flashback sequence we've had for a long time in Doctor Who, or ever, actually, I think. So, and also I remember, isn't it the first time we see any representation of prior
Paul
Doctors
McGann.
in Human Nature?
Oh.
Or is it just Paul McGann? That was the thing everyone got very excited about. Have we seen any of them, or is it? But yes, the fact that Paul McGann was included was canon, because some people thought there was a question mark over this. Definitely
I think it
caused a
was
stir.
any of them, but I'm not sure about that.
I think it's any of them, because we think
It is any of them, and it's just where the camera's pointing and the way they've edited it. It means it privileges Spoons and McGann, but they're all there, aren't they?
yes,
If you see the real thing.
we get it in the next Doctor, the Cyberman flashback, but that's obviously after this.
No.
I don't think we've had it.
My memory is that everyone got very excited, and it caused a lot of discussion, and a lot of anger, and a lot of joy, and good days.
When I started watching this today, when the title sequence kicked in, I was reminded of just how much I absolutely love Doctor Who at this point in time. It was so exciting. It was the focus of my life for those years. Yeah.
I think it was a kind of, there was a sort of purer sense of joy about it in that era. And I think across fandom in general, I mean, there were stories that people didn't like, and perhaps the Hobbity thing happening at the end of Series 3 was the first kind of real jarring note about across fandom. But on the whole, at the point that Human Nature went out, I think there was much less controversy across fandom about the show than in later eras.
That was the thing, is that watching today, I remember the pre-title sequence and then the title sequence, and I was that feeling of excitement from that title sequence was so visceral, and part of me thought, is it all just a false memory? Is it all just the memory cheats? And then the episode was so good. It was so good. It was so tightly written. It was so beautifully shot. Yeah, there were a handful of slightly dubious decisions, but nothing that ruined it. Nothing that really took me out of it. Apart from the Sydney and Verity, I take issue with that. But let's leave that. And I just sat thinking, this wasn't a group hallucination. This is absolutely brilliant TV drama, and it's not just good Doctor Who. It's good, brilliant TV drama, and no wonder the whole country talked about it. Like, all my friends would talk to me about Doctor Who. All of the not-wees would talk to me about Doctor Who during this era. 2007, 8, 9 was the absolute height, and I was so cool to be in any way involved in the world of Doctor Who, and I was very proud at the time to associate with the show. And now, more often than not, people say, I don't really watch it, to be honest. And sad.
Oh. How do we recover the ending to go from...
Well, I mean, that isn't that it? It sort of feels to me like we've hit the note. It's just going to be how it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, thanks, thanks all of you for joining me for this contemplative moment, and for the 2.5 hours that preceded it.
Jeepers.
But I'm sure it won't last that long for our listeners by the time we've edited it down. Listeners, we trust that you've enjoyed hearing our rambles, and we'll be back again with another combination of stories in about a month. In the meantime, we've got a very large back catalogue. If you've been fortunate enough not to have heard all of them by now, there's plenty more for you to go and listen to. And if you have listened to them all, well, you might have forgotten some of them by now. So there's always that possibility too. But for now, it's bye from me, and probably bye for them too.
Bye.
Bye.
What's the secret of comedy?
Timing. Anything you guys want to talk about that's happened lately or since we last gathered?
Has it been a month?
Yes.
Well, then it's gone very quickly. I think we've all been out enjoying the sun, haven't we?
Until this week.
Until this week, which is why we're back in again at our microphones, because there's nothing better to be doing.
Still been sweltering up these parts.
Oh, right.
Today's a little overcast, but it hasn't started raining yet here.
There you go. It's always
weather.
It's
We've
always
got
sunny in
to
the
the
north.
weather. Brilliant.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, well, moving on. So we're going to kick off. This is so slick. It's unbelievable.
But the beauty is you
Come
can
on,
leave all
everybody.
this in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay,
The
let's
more effort we put in, the less editing Richard has to do. Come on,
Yeah, that's right.
let's not be selfish.
Yeah.